Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Andrew Ferrier, and today I'd like to talk to you about some of my recent experiments doing vibe coding. Now, some of you who know me or may have been following this channel for a while will know that I maintain a number of open source repositories and projects. For example, two shown here, Debug, Print, and Wrapping. These are both NeoVim plugins. Memi is a file tracking tool. Normophone is a file name normalization tool. But recently, I wanted to start building, kind of as a scratch my own itch project, a tool which I'm calling Quican. And Quican is basically an open source dashboard, Kanban style dashboard for tracking to-dos, jobs to be done, and backing those with V2Do or iCalendar files, such as those used by the Apple ecosystem. Now, I wanted to build this, and I thought this would be an ideal opportunity to experiment with doing vibe coding in particular. Although I have a background in the past of doing front-end web development, I haven't done any for a while. I'm not as au fait with some of the newer technologies, such as, React in a deep way. And so I thought, well, this might be an interesting way. I have enough technical knowledge, I think, to understand what I want to build, but I don't necessarily have all the technological knowledge at my fingertips to, be able to build everything, from scratch without doing a fair bit of research and learning. So maybe let me try doing this doing vibe coding in particular. And Quican has ended up as around about 68 commits worth of work. It's approximately 10,000 lines of code that my vibe coding tool, which in this particular case is GitHub Copilot, has built for me. So, it's built a relatively substantial tool. And you can see a demonstration of what Quican looks like here. Here's the web front end. You can see that I've got various kind of sort of sample tasks on here. This is reasonably sophisticated. It has these different columns that I can drag these tasks between that automatically change the due dates and tasks. You can see that some are overdue. They can have different priorities. They can have different statuses. They can have different due dates. It even supports the concept of recurring tasks. Again, all of this is backed by what the V2Do iCal calendar standard allows. And if I were to show you, which I won't right now, but if I were to show you how this is stored under the covers, this is essentially a flat directory of iCal files, each of which represent one of the cards on this board. Now, the primary purpose of this video isn't to focus on the Quican tool itself. If you want to find out more about Quican, you can go to the repository here, andrewferrier/Quican, and read the README, where, it will explain some of the basic features and how to get it up and running if you want to try it out yourself. What I really want to talk today about is my experiences vibe coding Quican in particular. Now, let's get definitional for a second, because I think vibe coding is one of these terms that is somewhat overused, or in some cases misused, to mean or to overlap with AI-assisted engineering. And I don't think they are the same thing. If you go back to Andrej Karpathy's original definition of vibe coding, I think from 2025, yes, here we go, February 2025, what he's really talking about is letting go of the engineering, basically not really reading the code at all, just letting the AI assistant do its work, always accepting the changes, not really paying any attention to the underlying code that's been written. And of course, there may be some issues in doing that, and we'll talk about some of those issues later on. But nevertheless, I wanted to experience this and understand what this was like. And I'm contrasting this with some of my work on Memi in particular, one of my other open source projects. So Memi, as you may or may not be aware, is basically an open source file tracking tool implemented in Rust. This was a previous AI experiment by myself, again using GitHub Copilot as the tool, but really with Memi, what I wanted to do was I wanted to use it to kind of teach me Rust along the way. So I took the AI assistance in a much more incremental way. I directed it much more specifically from a technical perspective. I used it as an assistant assistant to build features which I would then review on a code basis, line by line, before committing them and implementing them. I would build the tests separately from the code and so on and so forth. And I've recorded a previous video, by the way, on this YouTube channel about how I did some of that stuff and some of the lessons that I learned along the way. But what I really did with Quicken was I went a step further and basically gave in to Karpathy's definition here and basically said, well, I'm just going to, build the tool without even paying any attention really to what Copilot is doing under the covers, right? And the tools are kind of the same, right? I used GitHub Copilot in both cases to build both pieces of software. But the prompts that I use and the mechanisms that I use are very different, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I learned along the way doing some of this vibe coding stuff. I think the first thing to understand is that as a technical person, it's very uncomfortable, right? It's very uncomfortable to say, hey, I want a feature that looks like this, right? So, initially, for example, on Quicken's board, I would only support, for example, cards, but the cards didn't have any notion of priority or status. I would basically say to GitHub Copilot, hey, go and add me these status and priority features. I wouldn't really talk about how I want those things to be implemented. In some cases, I didn't even talk about how I wanted them to visually appear on the screen. I just kind of let it figure out UI widgets that were appropriate to use for something of that nature. And I kind of gave into that kind of sort of vibe coding basis or way of working. And this is a very uncomfortable thing to do, right? Because as someone who has a background in software engineering and writing code, I like to write quality stuff, right? I like to make sure that it's, safe, secure, performant, not overly redundant is a big thing. Making sure that, we're kind of hitting all those quality bars. And that's very hard to do if you don't even really look at the code at all. Now, it's not true to say I haven't looked at the code of Quicken at all. I have, right? But there's 10,000 lines of code there, and I certainly haven't inspected all of it or inspected kind of all of the diffs all along. And it is really hard to actually let go of this notion of looking at the code. I still want to come in here. I still want to poke around. Oh dear, looks like GitHub itself is having a few issues there. I still want to kind of poke around and I want to take a look at the code, and I go and look in this, app file here, for example, this TypeScript, file here. And I, on some level understand what all of these different things are doing, and what their role is. But without going into depth on each and every one, I don't have a kind of overall cohesive understanding of how all the different pieces of my code fit together. And that's been intentional, but it's been uncomfortable. Now, one of the plus sides, one of the upsides of doing this is, of course, that I don't need to know all the technologies in depth. As I mentioned earlier, I have a background or part of my background is in front-end web development, right? But it's not bang up to date, right? So one of the briefs that I gave Copilot when I started building Quicken was, hey, use a modern stack of open source tools, right? So in this particular case, it's actually using, and we should be able to find it here, I think, in the agents.md file where where Copilot has actually captured the architecture and the components being used, right? So you can see the front end is written in React, TypeScript, and uses Tailwind CSS as a framework, which again is something I'm aware of. I know roughly what it does, but I've never really personally used it hands-on in anger. It's the backend is built in Node.js and Apollo Server, GraphQL, again, both of which I've used in the past, but don't have a huge amount of recent depth in kind of writing actual hands-on code. I architecturally understand what their role is. But basically, Copilot made the decision to use those components based upon my request for it to use, modern technologies. And, that's how it's kind of sort of chosen to implement it. So I don't necessarily need to know in detail how Tailwind CSS works. All I'm doing is saying things like, hey, I want to relay out the screen so that rather than having these 8 columns or however many that is, 9 columns that you see there, instead I want to have 7 columns. I want to combine next week and this weekend into one column. I want to change the icon that's on the in progress column and so on and so forth. And I'm letting it figure out all of the implications of that. So, if I were not a technologist, this would at least appear to me to be quite a powerful way of developing an application. Although there are still some downsides to that, and I'll talk more about those in a second. One of the downsides in particular I found of this type of vibe coding based development is it can be a little bit like whack-a-mole, right? So what will happen is I'll go and implement a feature or change something on the user interface, and something that was previously working breaks, right? Now that doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't seem to happen in a significant way, but it happens often enough. One of the things you might note if you've got a keen eye is that I've actually had Copilot write various different types of tests, for the software, write both end-to-end tests, but also unit tests in a number of places. And that certainly helps, because what it means is that the agentic framework that sort of drives Copilot sometimes notices that the code and the test are not in alignment, and figures out for itself what the issue is. And sometimes, of course, it's that the test needs fixing if the underlying functionality has changed, right? Or sometimes it's that the functionality needs changing because that's what I've requested, and so the test needs to change along with that. But the test, in one sense, acts as a bit of a guard, but it's certainly no guarantee, because the vibe coding tool is writing both the tests and the code, and it's doing it at more or less the same time. I've often tried to encourage it not to do that, although again, that's me acting as an engineer, not as a non-technical person. But there's absolutely no guarantee that happens, and generally I've tried not to interfere in that process. So doing it that way is less helpful. Enforcing unit tests and other types of automated tests is less helpful than if I were doing this in a purely agentic AI assisted way rather than a fully vibe coded way where I don't really look at the code and I don't really look at the diffs. And so what this means is, as I say, you do kind of get this whack-a-mole behavior where something that previously was working, suddenly it pops up and it's not working anymore. And then you have to kind of give it another prompt and say, hey, you broke this, go fix it, right? And I have found in general that's only tended to get worse as Quicken has gotten more complicated or more complex, I should say, and as I've added kind of more features to it. One of the things you might notice, I'll just see if I can quickly find it, don't actually have it ready to show, is that a number of the tests in here are playwright-based tests. Here we go. Yes. So we're actually looking for, particular HTML elements that are appearing on the page, for example. We're making sure that the page is rendering visually correctly, as well as kind of the more back-end elements of the code. And again, that's very intentional, right? Because I kind of wanted to give as many guards, as many protection layers to try and avoid things going wrong as possible. Initially, I started out not doing this, and I tended to find that visually things broke in terms of this user interface relatively frequently. And so that's one of the reasons why I introduced that playwright-based kind of visual layer. As with many of these things, if you're vague about the instructions that you give the AI coding tool, you get vague results, right? If I say, hey, just go and implement me a Kanban board, I'll get something that looks vaguely like a Kanban board, but it may choose to, pick titles for columns that make no sense, right? Or, it might implement Kanban features that it's choosing to do rather than that I want it to do. In general, I have found more precision in the spec, even non-technical precision, like precision and in terms of what I want to appear on the screen and how I want it to behave. User-described precision rather than implementer-described precision is still important to actually kind of get a meaningful result. it doesn't really matter, how hard I try to get my agentic tool, which again is Copilot in this case, to not be verbose and not insert comments everywhere. It still does that, right? This is a relatively well-known and understood and recognized issue with AI coding tools, is that they can tend to be like overly verbose, overly repetitive. They often break DRY, right? So they'll repeat themselves in various different places rather than factoring things out in a more elegant way like a human coder might. They'll insert lots of redundant comments that basically repeat the code, which is generally considered a bad practice. One of the things you might note is that in QuickHand's repository, there's a file called agents.txt. This is kind of an evolving standard for AI coding agents, basically a way in plain text to describe some of the things that you want your AI agent to understand and think about when it's working with the repository. You'll notice I've encouraged it here to add this comment, add a comment, ironically, about comments to this file, saying only add comments when they provide insight that isn't obvious from the code itself. Never add comments that just label or restate what the code does. And yet my experience is that not infrequently those things still happen, right? Because I'm vibe coding it, I don't tend to really interfere with that process, right? I just let it put whatever comments it wants in there. And if that's what it does, that's what it does, right? I try and generally discourage it this way, but I don't go and edit the diffs. I don't go and change the code after it's actually implemented it. Nevertheless, this still happens. And that's kind of sort of frustrating. One of the biggest worries and concerns I have, and it's not really a concern with this because this project is a bit of a kind of a proof of concept. It's primarily for my personal use at this point. I just use it for organizing my own personal to-dos. So I run it all locally on my local machine with a local file repository and so on. So it doesn't really use the network in any meaningful way at the moment. So this doesn't worry me right now, but security issues, basically, is where I'm going with this, right? So for all I know, there could be all kinds of security issues with this web-based front end here, right? And I haven't even come close to trying to audit them. I did experimentally, interestingly, one day actually ask Copilot to see if it could identify some security issues in its own code that it had written, and it did, or at least it claimed it did, and it fixed some of those security issues. But there could still be plenty more in here, right? There could be ways of kind of skipping past this. Now, this front end isn't really built to be secure anyway. At this point, it doesn't have an authentication or a login component, so you would never put this on the web as is in any event. As I said, at the moment, it's kind of primarily for my own internal use. But there could be all kinds of security or other kind of reliability or performance issues in here which are not apparent because, I haven't sort of rigorously thought through every layer of the architecture and, what the implications of that might be and so on and so forth. And so that is potentially one of the biggest worries in using vibe coding approaches. I shouldn't say vibe coding tools because generally it's AI tools in either case, but it's a vibe coding approach using an AI coding tool. It's one of the biggest issues is unforeseen kind of security issues like this. So in conclusion, I'd say I'm still adding features to QuickHand. Like I said, it's mostly a tool for my own personal use to scratch an itch anyway, right? And for that, it's actually been very useful because I would never have built this for myself without an AI agent. I didn't really need it. It was kind of like a nice to have. I've got other ways of tracking my to-do lists and so on. So I didn't really need this, but I thought it would be a fun experiment to learn vibe coding with. I never would have built it if that hadn't been an opportunity, if that hadn't been a possibility. So it opened up that door. But as I said, as it's getting bigger and bigger, it's becoming more and more clunky and harder to keep straight. And even though I have made it open source here, just because, well, why not, right? Ultimately, this isn't something I would necessarily feel super comfortable at this point with others using as is, just because I don't entirely trust all of the internals myself. That said, if I was creating something rough for myself in the future, which I don't necessarily need to hand maintain, or maybe a one-off bit of code to convert from file format A to file format B, I might well vibe code that, right? If data correctness or security is kind of essential, though, I think that's where I'd want to step down to understanding every line of the code, and falling back to I was going to say more traditional AI assisted approach. It's not traditional at all, but something that mixes AI assistance and conventional software engineering. Having said that, everything I'm seeing here, and in particular from the more rigorous kind of AI engineering-led approach, is, I don't know that I'm ever going to write large volumes of code again at this point. Obviously, that has a lot of kind of implications for our industry, and it has a lot of implications for other things, which I won't go into in this video. But, as someone who's sort of primarily a software engineer, so someone who sits at the intersection of software engineering and architecture, I would say it's fairly accurate to say I'm probably not going to be writing large volumes of code again in my career at this point, given the AI assistance tools that are available. And what I'm talking about here today, vibe coding, is kind of at the extreme of that. So anyway, that's my view on, or my experiences on vibe coding, at least so far. Again, obviously, I'm sure this will continue to evolve as everything does, but thank you very much for watching this video. Like I say, if you're interested in playing with Quicken, please go and take a look here. It is reasonably robust as is, but you heard my caveats earlier in the video, so take that all with a pinch of salt. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to comment on this video, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much for your time. Bye-bye.